He was called many things: a brawler, a troublemaker, a man who lived too close to the edge. But in the chaos of World War II, those very flaws became his greatest strength. This is the story of Edward Henry Blair, Paddy Mayne, a boy from Northern Ireland who grew up restless, too wild for classrooms, too fierce for the rugby field, and too untamed for the law career his family once imagined. While others saw his rage as a curse, history would prove it was something else entirely. The spark that helped create one of the most feared special forces units in the world, the SAS. Imagine a man who could turn the silence of the desert into a weapon, who could slip behind enemy lines and reduce entire airfields to flames, and yet who carried ghosts so heavy they followed him long after the war had ended. Was he a hero, a brute, or something in between? As we journey through his life, we'll discover not just how Paddy Mayne fought, but why he fought and what it cost him. And to understand that, we need to go back to where it all began, his childhood in Northern Ireland. 1. The making of a rebel. Paddy Mayne was born in 1,915 inches, the quiet town of Newtownards, Northern Ireland. His family home was orderly, respectable, the kind of place where neighbours admired the father a disciplined solicitor with a sharp mind, and where the mother instilled values of faith, duty, and good manners. On paper, it was the perfect environment for raising a son who might follow a straight path into law, business, or government service. But Paddy was never the boy on paper. Even as a child, he seemed to push against every fence built around him. Teachers found him intimidating his size. Even at a young age, outmatched boys older than him. And it wasn't just size, it was spirit. When challenged, he didn't back down. He exploded. He wrestled other boys not out of malice, but out of a restless hunger for proving himself. In the fields of County Down, while other children played quietly, Paddy disappeared for hours, rifle in hand, stalking deer across the hills. He wasn't a bully. But he loved the test of strength, the clash of will, the raw sensation of power. His brothers tried to temper him. His teachers tried to discipline him. None succeeded. For Paddy, confrontation wasn't something to avoid, it was how he understood the world. And here lies the first lesson in his story. Sometimes what seems like a flaw in ordinary life, a quick temper, a refusal to submit, becomes a weapon when the world itself turns violent. In a peaceful society, Paddy was a problem. In wartime, he would become a solution. But the war hadn't come yet. In the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds, his reputation grew not for academics or obedience, but for strength, stubbornness, and unpredictability. His family hoped he might mellow with age, find stability in studies or work. Instead, those instincts only grew sharper. Paddy wasn't content to fit into the mold carved for him. And so the stage was set. A boy born into order, destined to seek chaos. A young man who would one day step onto the rugby field and show the world just how unstoppable he could be when given a chance to unleash everything boiling inside. Because the next chapter of his life would take him from Irish hillsides to South African stadiums, where crowds would roar his name and where his temper would make him both celebrated and feared. 2. From law books to broken bones, rugby and boxing glory. When Paddy Mayne enrolled at Queen's University Belfast, he followed the path his father had hoped for, the study of law. The lecture halls, however, felt like prison walls. Legal arguments, dusty books, and endless rules never stirred his imagination. But outside the classroom, on the rugby field and in the boxing ring, Paddy found his true arena. Rugby was more than a sport in Ireland, it was a proving ground for toughness, courage, and raw endurance. And in the mid-1,930 seconds, few played with more ferocity than Paddy Mayne. At 6 feet tall and powerfully built, he was a wrecking ball in cleats. Tackles that stopped most men only fueled him forward. Spectators admired his relentless drive. Opponents feared the moment he set his eyes on them. Even his teammates kept a cautious distance, aware that Paddy's temper could erupt at any moment. In 1936, he achieved what many only dreamed of, a place on the British and Irish Lions tour to South Africa. For a young man barely out of university, this was an extraordinary honour. The tour was grueling hard tackles, bruising collisions, long days under the African Sunday. For most, it was a test of survival. For Paddy, it was a playground. His sheer intensity made him stand out, but so did his volcanic anger. When a disagreement boiled over during practice, he famously knocked a fellow player unconscious with a single punch. Word spread. He was feared not just for what he could do with the ball, but for what he might do off it. If rugby displayed his power, boxing revealed his precision. Inside the ring, Paddy fought with calculated aggression. His uppercuts and body blows weren't just strong, they were punishing. He fought to dominate, to leave no doubt who controlled the fight. Those who saw him fight remembered a man who never hesitated, whose fists carried the same certainty that his personality demanded in life. And yet, behind the headlines and cheers, a quiet truth lingered. Paddy was restless. Rugby and boxing gave him moments of release, but they couldn't contain the storm forever. His law studies faltered. His temper grew harder to ignore. He stood on the edge of two futures, one respectable, one destructive. Here lies the second lesson in his story. Raw energy can make you a star, but without purpose, it risks burning everything around you. For Paddy, sport was fuel, but not direction. He needed something bigger, something worthy of his fury. That moment arrived in 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and Britain declared war. Across the empire, young men trembled at the thought of battle. But not Paddy Mayne. For him, it was the answer to the question he had been living his whole life. Where does a man like him belong? The battlefield was calling, and Paddy would not hesitate to answer. 3. Answering the call. Enlistment and commandos. In September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, a hush fell across cities and villages. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, many with fear in their eyes, some with uncertainty in their hearts. But for Paddy Mayne, it was clarity. The restless energy that had made him both admired and feared finally had a purpose. The world was on fire, and he was ready to step into the flames. He first joined the Royal Artillery, a traditional branch considered fitting for educated men. It was steady, organised, and respectable. But steady had never been Paddy's style. Sitting behind guns, waiting for orders, and watching from a distance, it gnawed at him. He craved proximity to the enemy, the kind of fighting where he could feel the danger up close. That hunger led him to volunteer for one of Britain's newest experiments, the commandos. These were elite raiders, trained to strike fast, hit hard, and vanish before the enemy could react. Their training was brutal: long marches over mountains, dives into freezing seas, hand-to-hand combat that left men battered and broken. Many dropped out. Paddy thrived. The tougher it became, the more alive he felt. In March 1941, he got his first taste of combat during Operation Claymore, a raid on the German-held Lofoten Islands in Norway. The mission: destroy fish oil factories used for explosives, capture German soldiers, and snatch valuable intelligence. As the icy wind cut through their uniforms and bullets cracked across the snow, Paddy advanced without hesitation. He moved with a calm aggression, firing precisely, making each shot count. The raid was a success. Factories destroyed, equipment ruined, enemy prisoners taken. For most of the commandos, it was a victory worth celebrating. But for Paddy, it felt small. He hadn't joined to fight on the edges of the war. He wanted to go deeper, where the risks were greatest and the stakes higher. He wanted to test the very limits of what a man could endure. Here lies the third lesson in his story. The difference between good soldiers and great ones is not just skill, it is hunger. While others were content with following orders, Paddy yearned for freedom, for missions that pushed beyond the ordinary rules of war. That hunger would soon lead him to a chance encounter with a tall, confident officer named David Sterling. Sterling had a radical idea: a unit of small, ruthless teams that would strike deep behind enemy lines, destroying aircraft, supply depots, and morale itself. Regular officers dismissed the plan as madness. But when Sterling met Paddy, he saw the perfect man to turn madness into method. And so the restless brawler from Northern Ireland was about to help shape one of the most legendary forces in modern military history, the Special Air Service. 4. Meeting Sterling. Birth of the SAS. In the summer of 1941, the deserts of North Africa stretched like an endless ocean of sand. British forces were locked in a deadly chess match with Rommel's Afrika Korps, constantly pushed back, constantly bleeding. Conventional tactics weren't working. Something new was needed. something bold, dangerous, and unorthodox. Enter David Sterling. Tall, confident, and brimming with unconventional ideas, Sterling believed small, independent units could do what entire battalions could not: slip deep behind enemy lines, strike where it hurt most, and vanish before the Germans even realized what had happened. At first, the British High Command scoffed. Too risky, too radical, too unpredictable. But Sterling wasn't looking for ordinary soldiers. He was searching for men who didn't fit the mold, fighters who craved risk, who could improvise in chaos, who would see rules not as walls but as stepping stones. And that's when he met Paddy Mayne. By this point, Mayne's reputation already preceded him. He was fearless, ferocious, and, in the eyes of some commanders, uncontrollable. Sterling didn't see that as a problem. He saw it as potential. Where others feared Paddy's volatility, Sterling recognized a rare quality: a man who could turn unpredictability into an asset. When Sterling pitched his idea, the creation of a new unit under the deceptive name Special Air Service, or SAS, Mayne didn't hesitate. For him, this was exactly what he had been waiting for. No more waiting in line, no more fighting small raids at the edge of war. This was a chance to go straight into the heart of enemy territory. At the start, the SAS was little more than a name and a handful of men. But with Mayne among them, it began to take shape. He pushed the limits during training, drove his comrades harder, demanded silence, precision, and absolute courage. He was not just following Sterling's vision, he was shaping it. Here lies the fourth lesson in his story. Innovation in war doesn't come from comfort. It comes from those willing to embrace risk. Sterling had the vision, but Mayne had the ferocity to make it real. It didn't take long for the SAS to prove themselves. Under Sterling's leadership and Mayne's relentless drive, they prepared for their first desert raids. Night after night, they studied airfields, fuel depots, and convoys, rehearsing how to move like shadows through sandstorms and moonlight. Each man carried knives, grenades, and explosives instead of heavy weapons. The goal wasn't to fight toe-to-toe. The goal was to disappear into the dark, strike with precision, and leave destruction smoldering behind. The desert was about to become their hunting ground, and in that vast expanse of sand, Paddy Mayne would soon execute the raid that would etch his name into legend. 5. Desert Shadows. Mayne's innovations in North Africa. The desert is a strange kind of battlefield. Unlike the forests of Europe or the villages of France, there is no place to hide. Every movement leaves a trail in the sand. Every mistake can mean death beneath the blazing Sunday. To most soldiers, it was a nightmare. To Paddy Mayne, it was an opportunity. By late 1941, the SAS had begun its operations in North Africa. Their targets were not trenches or bunkers, but airfields, the lifeblood of Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Germans depended on aircraft to supply, scout, and strike across the vast expanse. If you crippled the plains, you crippled the desert war. One December night, Mayne led a small team toward an airfield near Wadi Tamet. They carried almost no firearms. Instead, each man carried knives, grenades, and bundles of explosives. The desert wind covered their movements as they crawled toward the rows of parked aircraft. While others might have trembled, Mayne moved with the calm of a hunter. He placed the charges himself, one by one, under the bellies of German planes. When dawn broke, the sky lit with flames. 24 aircraft gone. Steel twisted into blackened wreckage, fuel tanks exploding into towers of fire. It was not just a victory, it was a message. The Germans had believed their airfields, deep in the desert, were untouchable. Mayne proved them wrong. And this was only the beginning. Mayne refined the art of desert warfare. Instead of slow convoys, he stripped vehicles down to lightweight jeeps armed with Vickers machine guns. They could move fast, strike hard, and vanish before German patrols reacted. He pioneered diversionary tactics, setting fires in one direction to draw the enemy while his men attacked from another. He insisted on silence and precision, punishing hesitation. Under his influence, the SAS became more than a unit. It became a terror that haunted German pilots. Reports spread quickly. Pilots slept with pistols under their pillows, guards doubled their patrols, and Luftwaffe officers whispered about the ghost raiders who came with the wind. In truth, It was Mayne's methods, his ability to turn the emptiness of the desert into cover, that created that fear. Here lies the fifth lesson in his story. True innovation often comes not from technology, but from imagination. Where others saw endless sand, Mayne saw a battlefield of infinite possibility. For months, the SAS operated like phantoms, crippling Rommel's ability to dominate the skies. But their greatest test was yet to come. In early 1943, David Stirling, the man who had dreamed the SAS into existence, was captured by Axis forces. The future of the unit hung in the balance. Would the SAS collapse without its founding leader? It was in this moment that Paddy Mayne stepped forward, not just as a fighter, but as the ruthless commander who would carry the SAS into its most dangerous chapters yet. 6. The ruthless leader, taking command after Stirling. In January 1943, David Stirling, visionary, founder, the man who had pulled together the SAS from scraps of an idea, was captured by Axis forces in Tunisia. For most units, losing their leader would have meant the end. For the SAS, it meant a transformation, because waiting in the wings was a man far less patient, far less forgiving, and far more dangerous. Paddy Mayne. Mayne didn't inherit the SAS with speeches or strategy papers. He inherited it by action. He wasn't the kind of commander who sat at headquarters drawing lines on maps. He was the first out of the jeep, the first to set charges, the first to fire. His men both respected and feared him. He demanded silence, precision, and absolute courage. Hesitation was punished, sometimes with words, sometimes with fists. Those who couldn't keep up were cut from missions. The results were undeniable. In Sicily, Mayne led lightning raids against German convoys and outposts. One night, his unit slipped through rough terrain and struck a German communication hub. When the smoke cleared, radio posts were reduced to rubble, tanks burned in the darkness, and nearly 80 enemy soldiers lay dead, many killed before they even knew the SAS were there. Survivors described the attack as if shadows had materialized into death itself. In Italy, Mayne's brutality became legend. Stories circulated of him killing a German officer with the man's own helmet, or strangling enemies with his bare hands. Some of these tales may have been exaggerated, but they reveal how his reputation spread among his men and among his enemies. He despised cruelty toward civilians, but when it came to enemy soldiers, he had no patience for mercy. For Mayne, war was not about taking prisoners. It was about ending the fight as quickly and violently as possible. Here lies the sixth lesson in his story. Leadership can take many forms, but in war, some leaders are followed not because they inspire hope, but because they embody fearlessness. Mayne's men knew that if they followed him, they would return either victorious or not at all. There was no middle ground. This uncompromising style turned the SAS into an even sharper blade. They weren't just raiding fuel depots or cutting telegraph wires anymore. They were striking at the core of German defenses, ambushing tanks, destroying bridges, and leaving chaos behind. Allied commanders began to realize what Stirling had always known. The SAS was not a gamble. It was a necessity. But with every victory came escalation. Mayne's appetite for risk grew. His raids became bolder, deadlier, and more personal. To the Germans, he was becoming a phantom of the battlefield. To his men, he was both savior and executioner. And soon, his ferocity would be tested on the biggest stage of all, Normandy. Day was coming, and the SAS would once again slip behind enemy lines. Under Paddy Mayne, they would strike with a ruthlessness that would haunt the hedgerows of France forever. 7. Behind enemy lines in Normandy, the 6th of June, 1944 D-Day. While thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches under withering fire, the SAS were already at work in the shadows. Dropped from low-flying planes deep inside occupied France, their mission was clear. Cripple German reinforcements before they could ever reach the coast. Among them was Paddy Mayne. By now, he wasn't just another raider, he was the embodiment of the SAS spirit. Scattered and disoriented after the parachute drop, he gathered his men quickly. They moved through the bocage, those dense, twisting hedgerows of Normandy like ghosts. Explosives were planted under bridges, railway lines sabotaged, convoys ambushed in the dead of night. German trains derailed in showers of sparks. Fuel trucks exploded into pillars of smoke. Supply routes the Wehrmacht had counted on suddenly became death traps. One operation revealed the essence of Mayne's method. His team mined a road in advance of a German armoured column. When the first truck hit the charge, the explosion tore open the night. Chaos followed, tanks tipped into ditches, soldiers scrambled in confusion. Instead of retreating, Mayne walked among the wreckage, firing calmly, methodically. Survivors described it not as a battle, but as an execution. Another raid struck a German communication hub disguised as a farmhouse. At dawn, Mayne burst through the door with his Thompson raised. The fighting inside was brutal and fast, rifle butts smashed skulls, desks splintered under the weight of blows, and within minutes the farmhouse was reduced to rubble and silence. Stories like these spread quickly. To civilians, the SAS were liberators. To German troops, they became a nightmare. Rumors described them as invisible killers who struck without warning and vanished with the mist. Mayne encouraged that fear, knowing that terror itself was a weapon. Yet there was a darker side. In one village near Saint-Lô, German soldiers had turned the town hall into a command post and used civilians as shields. Mayne's solution was merciless. His men surrounded the building and set it ablaze. Flames consumed timber, stone cracked under heat, and screams echoed through the night. Any soldier who leapt from the windows was cut down. To Mayne, it was war stripped of illusions, swift, brutal, and without compromise. Here lies the seventh lesson in his story. In the chaos of war, the line between necessity and cruelty blurs. Mayne believed every ruthless act saved Allied lives at the front, but each action also carved deeper scars on his enemies, his men, and himself. For the SAS, Normandy was proof of their value. They derailed reinforcements, crippled supply lines, and bought precious time for the beachhead to hold. For Mayne, it was another step into shadows that grew darker with every mission. His victories came at a price, and that price was starting to follow him home in silence, in nightmares, and in sudden bursts of rage. The war was far from over, and as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, Mayne's violence would only intensify. The question was no longer whether he could win, but whether he could survive the weight of what winning required. 8. The weight of war, trauma, and transformation. By 1944, Paddy Mayne was no longer just a soldier, he was a myth walking among his men. His raids had crippled German supply lines, destroyed airfields, and terrorized entire units. But even legends carry shadows, and for Mayne, those shadows grew heavier with every mission. The signs were subtle at first: long silences after raids, a drink too many when the night fell. Then came the sudden bursts of rage fists, slamming tables, violent words thrown at comrades. In the middle of the night, he would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, hand reaching instinctively for his sidearm. For him, the war never paused. Even in sleep, the battlefield followed. Back then, it had a simple name: shell shock. Today, we call it PTSD. But in the 1,940 seconds, no one understood the full weight of what these men carried. You were expected to fight, to win, and then to simply return to normal. Yet how could a man who had burned villages, strangled enemies, and watched comrades die ever return to normal? His men noticed the changes. Some whispered about his silence. Others saw the toll it took when he drowned the ghosts with alcohol. And yet, when the morning came, he was always ready, eyes sharp, weapons steady, leading from the front as if nothing was wrong. That was Paddy. Unbreakable on the outside, cracked on the inside. Here lies the 8th lesson in his story. War does not end when the gunfire stops. For some, the fiercest battles are the ones fought in silence against memory, guilt, and ghosts that never leave. But despite the growing weight on his shoulders, Mayne never slowed down. In early 1945, as Germany collapsed, the SAS launched new operations in shattered towns and frozen forests. Ammunition depots, airfields, barracks, the targets kept coming, and so did the destruction. For Mayne, stopping was not an option. Movement was survival. He had once been a restless boy in Northern Ireland, unable to sit still. Now, decades later, the same restlessness drove him through the ruins of Europe, still hunting, still fighting, as if to keep ahead of the memories chasing him. But the truth was unavoidable. Every victory was leaving scars no medal could heal. And as the war reached its bloody climax, Mayne's ruthlessness would reach its peak, turning the closing months of 1945 into both his greatest triumphs and his darkest moments. 9. The final years. Glory denied. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, the Wehrmacht was retreating, and Allied victory was inevitable. But for Paddy Mayne, the mission had not changed. While others began to imagine peace, he kept moving, hunting, destroying, driven as if war was the only language he still understood. In April, his SAS unit stormed a heavily fortified barracks near the Ruhr. The firefight lasted less than half an hour. When it ended, more than 100 German soldiers were dead, many before they even had the chance to fire back. The walls were shredded with bullet holes, the floors stained with blood. Mayne walked through the wreckage, checking bodies one by one, making certain none would rise again. In another operation, his men intercepted a fleeing SS convoy. Instead of attacking at range, Mayne ordered a full-speed ambush. Trucks flipped, tires exploded, survivors crawled into the dirt. None escaped. Weapons were burned, records destroyed, the convoy erased as if it had never existed. For Mayne, war was not about statistics, it was about erasure. By the end of the war, his record was staggering. More than 30 confirmed raids, dozens of ambushes, over 130 enemy aircraft destroyed. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, not once, but 3 times, an almost unheard-of honor. His men saw him as a war god, a figure larger than life, someone who had bent the chaos of war to his will. And yet, one honor was missing. Many believed Mayne deserved the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the British Empire. His actions fit the standard, repeated acts of conspicuous gallantry, often at the risk of his own life. But the medal never came. Officially, his feats were considered extraordinary, but not within the strict criteria. Unofficially, some whispered that his reputation for violence, his brawling, his disregard for authority had cost him the recognition he deserved. For a man who had given everything, it was a bitter silence. When the war ended in May 1945, Mayne returned home to Northern Ireland, medals on his chest, but ghosts in his head. Civilian life felt hollow. The courtrooms of law, once his father's legacy, now seemed meaningless. He tried business ventures, failed. He tried companionship, drifted away. What remained was the bottle and the fights. Pub brawls became routine. Old instincts, the same rage that had fueled him in Normandy and Sicily, now erupted in bars and back streets. Friends recalled him sitting alone for hours, eyes fixed on nothing, lips whispering names of men buried in foreign soil. At night, nightmares dragged him back to burning villages and shattered airfields. The war might have ended for the world, but not for Paddy Mayne. On the 14th of December 1955, he drove through the streets of New Townards in the early hours of the morning. His car struck a lamppost. There were no skid marks, no sign he tried to brake. He was only 40 years old. The official record called it an accident. Those who knew him best feared it was something else, a man finally surrendering to the ghosts he could never silence. Here lies the 9th lesson in his story. Glory in war does not guarantee peace in life. Recognition can be denied, but trauma cannot be erased. And yet, even in death, Paddy Mayne's story was not over. Because his legacy, both feared and admired, would live on in the DNA of every Special Forces unit that came after him. 10. Legacy of a reluctant war god. When Blair Paddy Mayne's car struck that lamppost in 1955, many in Northern Ireland mourned the loss of a local son, but few grasped the full weight of what had been lost. For those who had served with him, the silence was heavier. They knew they had not just lost a comrade, but a force of nature, a man who had reshaped the very meaning of special operations. The Special Air Service, the unit Mayne had helped mould in fire and blood, went on to become a model for elite forces around the world. Their tactics, stealth raids, hit-and-run strikes, deep penetration into enemy territory were adopted by the American Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and Delta Force. Today, when U.S. Special Forces conduct precision raids in deserts, jungles, or cities, they are, in some small way, walking the path that Mayne once carved in the sands of North Africa. In his hometown, statues stand to honor him. His name is etched in regimental histories, his story told in whispers among soldiers training for missions where failure is not an option. And yet, his legacy is complicated. Some remember the innovator, the fearless leader who saved countless Allied lives. Others remember the brutality, the helmet kills, the burned buildings, the refusal to take prisoners. Even now, debates rage over whether he should have been awarded the Victoria Cross, a medal many argue was unjustly withheld. Perhaps that is fitting. Paddy Mayne was not a man who fit neatly into categories of hero or villain. He lived in the space between ruthless yet loyal, destructive yet visionary. His life reminds us that legends are rarely simple. They are forged in contradictions. For American audiences, his story carries a deeper resonance. The United States has long celebrated its warriors, the Marines at Iwo Jima, the paratroopers at Normandy, the SEALs in modern conflicts. Mayne's journey mirrors those same truths, that behind every daring raid and every hard-won victory stands a man carrying burdens that medals cannot lighten. His triumphs were undeniable. His scars were unavoidable. Here lies the final lesson in his story. Greatness often comes with a price. Paddy Mayne gave the world new ways to fight, but the cost was written in his silence, his sleepless nights, and his lonely end. War gave him purpose, but peace took it away. Today, when young SAS recruits train in the same uncompromising style he pioneered, they carry more than just his tactics. They carry his warning that to fight like a god, you must live with the weight of being human. And so, the boy who once wrestled in Irish fields, who became the terror of German airfields, who led men through shadows and fire, remains both a legend and a cautionary tale, a reluctant war god whose battle never truly ended, even when the world around him finally found peace.